This is Rochelle Jordan, and you're listening to the Balaker podcast.
Thank you, good people, for tuning in to the Balaker podcast. And this is the first time I've ever been recording with a fake mustache that my 8-year-old put on without me knowing, but I was technologically savvy enough to get it off. But if you guys want me to do it in the future, please let me know in the comments. I am really stoked for today's guest because she is an avid hiker, an NCAA soccer player, a Humane Society volunteer, which basically means she's a wonderful person. And she splits her time between Anchorage and Portland. Please welcome Rochelle Jordan to the show. How are you doing, Rochelle?
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Well, thanks for being on, and thank you for rolling with my mustache. As a teenager, I worked so hard, to get some cool looking facial hair. And now that I'm middle-aged, I spend a lot of time shaving it off. But Anchorage, Alaska, and Portland, Oregon, two very cool, kind of very, I think, seemingly different places. How do you decide how to split your time between these two places?
Yeah, I think that's kind of an easy one. Anchorage has a super long and super cold winter. So I think I pretty much tried to get up there in the summer. That was my hometown. So I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. And while I love a lot of snow sports, I grew up cross-country skiing and still getting outside with my super active family in the winter. I went to college here in Portland and loved it and love how it's green year round and love to be here in the winter. So that's kind of what guided that transition.
That's a smart guide. Let the weather determine. Exactly. I went, we took our family to Portland. We have, my wife has some family out there in the summer, and it's beautiful. Although I think I hit the 90-degree week in summer last year. I think it was in June, July time.
Yeah, there's always one.
But I want to learn more about Alaska, but briefly in Portland. I remember we went to some place that had, we'd get this coffee, hemp milk, delicious, but it would just happen to be near the Airbnb we're staying. I'm not a local. I'm not as cool as you. If people are spending a few days there, where would you point them for either good coffee or good recreational activities in Portland?
Goodness, there's so much good coffee, and I always love Stumptown coffee roasters because they don't have an upcharge for plant-based milk. So as a vegan, it's always really refreshing to go somewhere and just say what kind of milk you want and not have the dollar upcharge. I think that's really awesome, and that's hopefully other coffee shops will catch on, but that's my favorite locally. In terms of recreational activities, I mean, there's so much. It's not quite as accessible as it is in Anchorage, but if you like to get outside, they always say Portland's an hour from the coast and an hour from Mount Hood. So you kind of have the best of both. So if you want to go get up to ski, head towards Mount Hood. If you want to go to the coast and do some hiking on the Oregon Coast Trail, there are a lot of beautiful places to go explore out west.
You're a wealth of knowledge, and I was a little reluctant to go whitewater rafting, and it was awesome. So I strongly recommend that. So Rochelle, I want to learn more about Alaska. In high school, I went to Fairbanks for a few days, and it was cool, but I mean, that's a far cry. I remember falling on the ice and thinking I was going to break my tailbone, but my tailbone survived. But tell us about your life growing up in Alaska. What do you recall most?
Yeah, so I loved growing up in Alaska. I grew up, of course, in Anchorage, which is about 6 hours from Fairbanks, so it's pretty far. Everything's pretty spread out. Whenever anyone's visiting, I always tell them that their itineraries are very ambitious because no one really expects that much driving time. I think my favorite parts about growing up there were just the accessibility to the natural environment in Alaska. I think backpacking, hiking, biking, all of that is so accessible there. And I definitely didn't know any different while I was growing up there, but having lived in other places, I can come to appreciate that that was a really, really special place, and really great environment to grow up in.
Yeah, great environment. And do you think it makes one tougher living there, or is that just the media influence on me? What do you say, Rochelle?
I don't want to debunk any myths or take that away from people, but I'd have to say that Anchorage, I think it's a bigger city than people realize. I think it's about 300,000 people, so it's actually a sizable city. So we have access to all the normal things, and I think people don't necessarily realize that. I think just it's the experience is what you make it. So you can definitely get tough there for sure. There are certainly many, many people that I grew up with that were ultra marathon runners and triathletes and mountaineers, and so those people are much tougher than I am, but you can be as tough as you want.
A simple marathon is not enough, Rochelle. You have to be an ultra marathoner. And yeah, I mean, like if it's 55 here in California, I get cold. I mean, I remember in Alaska, it could be, I remember visiting, it was -9 and people were wearing not quite t-shirts, but they weren't freaking out. So I'm about as untough as they get in my environment. So maybe I need to journey to the great frontier for a little while.
You did pick Fairbanks, which is one of the coldest in the interior Alaska. So, I mean, that was pretty brave of you.
Yeah, as a 15-year-old who knew no better, I was very brave. But what so how long did you live in Alaska, Rochelle?
I lived there from, when I was born up until I went to college at Lewis and Clark here in Portland. So, 18 years.
So 18 years you're up there. And what was your first job? I guess your first job before college, if you had one.
Yeah, I did. I worked actually as a hostess server at Village Inn in Anchorage. So they do have those there. And that's where I worked prior to coming to college. That was my high school job. So
you worked at the Village Inn. One of my first quote unquote real jobs was I worked at a coffee house. I don't remember, it was a long time. I don't remember if we had an upcharge for plant-based milk, but I do remember we had some customers who were cool, some who were kind of a pain in the ass. It's my belief, and I want to get your take. This is just my opinion, that almost everyone should work in food services just for the tribulations of dealing with customers, often unruly. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, I totally agree with you. I've heard that before and shared that with others, and I think there's nothing. I really actually loved it. I loved, kind of meeting new people, meeting visitors, establishing connections with regulars. But I think it was super formative in my kind of customer facing experience from that age, just to build into a career where you can interact with people. And then later when I got into kind of jobs where I was dealing with people at their worst, it was really helpful for me to have that kind of background. Just meeting people where they're at and not getting flustered when someone's upset about their coffee being terrible.
I like what you said, Rochelle, about dealing with people at their worst. And I swear, if you mess up an order or they get the wrong food, like that is people at their worst. What are some tactics or some strategies you have that kind of help de-escalate dealing with unruly or maybe annoying customers?
Yeah, I think from that experience, and then even taking it a step further into kind of emergency department and veterinary medicine, when people are dealing with really emotionally triggering experiences, making them feel heard is step one. So people always want to kind of feel validated and feel heard. And if you approach it from kind of trying to be very sympathetic and have a lot of empathy for their situation, I think you're always starting on the right foot. So that would be what I would say.
That is, well, you should write a business book. Although the thing is, it might only need to be one page. And
just that one.
Listen to people. You reminded me of my first kind of real job post-college. I worked at an investment fund, and it was a husband-wife team. And the wife was an attorney, and she would kind of handle more of we'll call it HR duties. And I remember after 6 months there, I got like a different contract, and she explained all the stuff to me. I understood maybe 8% of it. And then she's like, well, how are you? Is there anything like, what do you want to share? And I remember just thinking like, this woman went to Harvard. She was really smart, and she's asking me for my opinion. I was like, I have nothing to say, but I just really appreciate you asking me that. And listen, and I really like that made me like not want to negotiate farther. And I don't think she meant it to like undercut my pay or anything like that, but it's just a simple, but such an important thing, like listen to people. So thank you for bringing that up. So you mentioned, and working at the emergency room. Yeah, you've worked with people and animals, but I want to first talk about the human aspect. When did you get into medicine?
Yeah, it was actually after I had been in the veterinary field for a little while. So I pivoted a little bit, moved back to Anchorage for about a year and worked in the emergency department at Alaska Regional Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And that was really just because I thought that I wanted to sort of transition into human medicine from veterinary medicine. And it was a really formative experience. Ultimately, obviously, I decided not to pursue medical school, but that was sort of the reason that I entered into that field in the first place.
So you were dealing with ER. What sticks out from your time there, Rochelle?
Oh my gosh, just the immense compassion from the nurses. I was always super, super impressed with their ability to just be, working quickly, super fast-paced environment. You never know what's going to come in the door. And they were always just so gracious and happy. And that was super impressive to me, and just a lesson to be learned for, whatever situation you're in, you can definitely carry yourself with joy and with, a willingness to kind of to talk to people and to be really nice about it.
I mean, nurses, and I think lots of medical professionals in general have an amazing ability, and it's something I want to learn better myself, is making people feel heard, kind of like you mentioned moments ago, without necessarily giving them hours and hours of time.
Right. Yeah.
And when you're a nurse, you might see 15 patients, but you could be dealing with tough lab results or God knows what. And to make them feel like you're not rushed away is such a talent. My wife was when she was working at somewhere in LA years ago. It was at an ER story. There was a love triangle. Well, I don't know if love's the right word, but a woman caught her boyfriend in bed with another woman, did not like it very much, and stabbed the other woman into the eye.
Wow.
And the only damage that happened to the woman who had stabbed was a few stitches. It missed her eye, it missed her brain. Any crazy stories you remember of people just dealing with like these
Oh yeah, I mean, so many crazy stories. I think the craziest was a gunshot wound that happened actually like right outside of the ER. There was an altercation, and it was like immediately came in, it actually ended up being a happy ending. He survived. Somehow the bullet went through kind of his torso area without hitting any internal organs. So that was super, super lucky. But the other thing you deal with in Anchorage a lot is frostbite. And so I saw a lot of, especially on night shifts, folks that would come in that had been drinking or not aware of how cold they were getting, and they just have like these crazy frostbitten hands, and they just walk in and you'd be like, oh my gosh, get them back there. This is not good. So I learned that actually it can be surgical most of the time if it's severe enough.
If you're missing a few fingertips, does that give you like extra street cred in Anchorage?
Ooh, I'm not super familiar with the street cred.
You're not the arbiter of street credibility. I figured you might be. I wasn't sure.
It depends on how many fingers you have, I guess.
Well, so you worked in human medicine, but you obviously have a passion for animals. And I want to get into that. Where did this start, Rochelle?
Well, it's actually kind of a circular story. So in high school, I saw an expose done by Paul McCartney. I think he produced it that was called Glasswalls. And the premise was, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, then everyone would be vegan or vegetarian. So I watched that in high school and was just horrified by the way that we treat animals within the food system. And I think there's a really large disconnect between what happens on factory farms and that kind of side of our food system and what we're buying at the grocery store. You don't see any of that. You have a picture of, a cow walking in a field on the ground beef that you're buying, and then it's completely misrepresenting what's actually happening. And so I think that was a really big eye opener for me. And I actually decided kind of that right after seeing it, I was like, okay, I'm going to go vegetarian. And my family was really receptive. I think it would have been really difficult if they weren't, and I could understand how hard that would be. But my mom kind of jumped on board and said, okay, I'll do it with you.
Wow.
Which was great. So pretty much my entire family was on board. And then in college, it was actually my sister who went vegan first, fully vegan, because I was just vegetarian at the time. And so we started kind of looking into it. She went vegan for some health related things. And so we started looking into kind of the health aspect. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this has a huge, impact on our healthcare system, on health in general. And then just kept kind of digging further and realized the environmental impact on top of all of that. So it was kind of these three pillars that I realized was being caused by our food system, and wanting to be really involved in kind of removing animals from that. So that's what sort of led me then to Glasswall, into the alternative protein space. But sort of all started with that Glasswall video.
So,
and now I work for Glasswall Syndicate.
It's a nice story. And for younger listeners out there, Paul McCartney is a famous musician with the Beatles. Ask your parents or grandparents about them. They'll probably tell you a lot. But I want to unpack what you said and what you did a little bit, because I think most teenagers are vegetarian or vegan for at least a couple weeks, or they like a certain kind of music, it's an age where things rarely stick. Sometimes they do, but I'd say more often, things are phases. You weren't that case. What is it about you or you mentioned your family, like why do you think you were able to stick with it, Rochelle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it has a lot to do with the support that I got from my family. I think it's really difficult if you're, at 15 years old trying to, cook your own meal if your family is like, no, we're not doing that with you. So I think that was a big part of it. Also, I've always been an animal lover. And so just those images of seeing animals in positions like that kind of clicked for me, that was what was on my plate. So it just sort of sounded gross, if that makes sense, because I'd always been I've always wanted to go to vet school. I've always been a really big animal advocate. So I think that was enough for me to really look at what I was eating and be like, oh, I don't want any part of this.
And then you have the support system. Then it sounds like your sister became vegan for health reasons. What are some of I'm in California, and I think they kick you out if you don't have a food allergy or a food sensitivity. They send you to Portland. No, I'm just kidding. What are some of the health conditions that we'll call it a plant-based diet will help with?
Yeah, so for her, it was skin related, and that's been, something where there's not strong scientific evidence to support, the relationship between dairy and skin conditions, but anecdotally, it's been reported in several cases that it helps with, hormonal acne and things of that nature. In terms of really serious health conditions, there's a lot of red meat causes a lot of inflammation, heart disease, some really, really serious health conditions that can be even reversed in some cases by a plant-based diet. And heart disease is one of the largest diseases that affects the US population. So even just tackling that one with red meat, reducing that consumption would be super great to see.
Yeah. And you're a good example of, people can have different reasons for kind of choosing the same lifestyle, for lack of a better word. Some it's more ethical, moral, some it's plant-based, but now it seems like there are a lot more options for people. And you mentioned Glasswall Syndicate, and sort of as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's like kind of an intersection of venture capital and the nonprofit world. What do you mean by that? Or am I understanding that correctly, Rochelle?
Yeah, I'm so happy to dive into this because it is kind of a confusing space. Let's dive in. Glasswall Syndicate is, like you said, at the intersection of nonprofit and venture capital. So essentially, we're a nonprofit organization, a 501c6, where we're bringing quality deal flow, which means companies that are under the thesis of removing animals from the consumer supply chains. That's, an alternative protein or alternatives to animal testing or alternative materials, to investors that have a mission to invest under that thesis. So we're essentially playing kind of a matchmaker role between those, in making sure that angel investors can put their money where their mission is, and impact invest in companies that are doing great things.
Like there's an old saying, it's like vote with your wallets.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think Glasswall sort of embodies that. And what are some of the, people out there are familiar with maybe Beyond Meat or Impossible Company, Impossible Burgers. What are some of the technologies that are out there for people who want to embrace animal-free lifestyle?
Yeah, and there are so many. Beyond and Impossible have done a fantastic job in kind of pioneering the meat analog space, but there are also a lot of companies out there that are doing, a lot of food tech, like precision fermentation or cultivated meat, where you're actually creating actual meat. It's meat out of cells rather than from the animal, so it's animal free.
Yeah, like we have a friend, I have a friend, Claire Smith, she's very involved, and she kind of alerted me to when did you what were your first thoughts when you heard about this, like lab grown meat, like from a vegan perspective, good, bad, and different? What say you?
I think great. Ultimately, I think it's a really great technology. I think we can make a lot of impact with it. We have really far to go with cultivated meat. From a personal perspective, I haven't eaten meat in so long that it doesn't really matter to me. But in terms of enacting big change, what we've learned is that taste is king. And so, or queen. And and so I from that, perspective, it's really an exciting prospect to think, we can make the exact same product eventually cheaper, eventually without animals.
Well, I'm glad you brought the eventually part, because you and I are talking to each other, I assume via computer. And in the 1980s, 1990s, we had a less robust machine in front of us, and it would have cost tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. I don't know the exact figures. And fast forward a few decades, and they're still ubiquitous. So I bring this up because what might seem expensive now to grow a filet mignon in the lab when you could just buy one, it's not always going to be that way. What do you think about, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. There's no, there's so much science out there that points to our food system needing to be transformed, and be much more efficient. And I think all of these technologies are at the beginning stages, but we'll get there with them. And it will be, you'll be able to go to the grocery store or go to a restaurant and order a cultivated something.
Yeah. Well, one thing I love about what Glasswall is doing, and my friend Claire, is it reminds me of an old saying. Sorry. It's like, we all want to change other people's minds, but we don't want to change our own. And people, you could take, by you, I mean, animal advocates could wag their fingers and say, you're killing innocent species, and you have a good argument, I'm not arguing with that. But that brings up kind of the porcupine quills on other people. But what you guys are doing, it's like, it's lowering barriers. It's like there could be someone who grew up eating meat. That was a very different philosophy on it than you might. But there's a whole different argument now. You can say, would you rather make only what you're eating, or have to rely on a whole animal, which takes water, which takes land, and in order to feed it, that takes other water, more land. It's just so inefficient. Like, what has been the response for what you're doing from, I guess, we'll call it non-vegan investors?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that we talk a lot about, of course, because there are so many investors in climate tech. And sometimes that doesn't include food, which is, it definitely should. So I think we don't talk about food enough. But I think that a lot of climate investors are kind of pivoting to include alternative protein within their thesis, because it is such a big part of our impact on the planet. And as you said, the inefficiency of eating meat is just that. It's so inefficient because you're feeding an animal, you're growing food to feed an animal to then feed another animal. And so climate tech, food transformation is such a important piece of climate tech, that it's been a kind of a shift, hopefully, to see a lot of climate tech investors include alternative proteins more and more in their investment strategies.
Yeah, it's heartening. And you're a good example of someone who can match their passion with a profession. And in this program, we interview lots of people who are maybe dissatisfied with the job, and they said, the hell with that, I'm gonna create my own path. But you were able to do it at a pretty young age, where you're able to match what you do for a living with what interests you. How did that happen?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I guess I was on sort of the veterinary path. I was working in veterinary medicine. I was always sort of thinking that I would go to vet school, and I was working in the veterinary industry and sort of just feeling like I was unfulfilled, because we were putting in so much energy into helping companion animals, and that's so important. But at the same time, we're slaughtering millions of animals, millions and millions of animals every day. So I decided to sort of pivot from that. And I think just was guided by the fact that I needed to be doing something where I thought was making the biggest impact I could. And from the research that I did and the experiences that I had, I found that was in food, and working to not only convince people to go vegan, because that hasn't worked. I'm telling someone who eats meat every day, you should go vegan because of this. It's not as simple as that. There's a lot of complexity in the meat industry. It's highly subsidized by the government. And so it's really hard to, for a lot of different reasons, just tell someone to go vegan and expect that to be enough. So I think that I wanted to be in a space where, kind of similar to what you were saying earlier, lowering barriers to that's where I see where we can make real change. And then sort of found my way to it through the Good Food Institute, which is a really large nonprofit within the space. I looked at kind of employment through them, and they told me about Glasswall Syndicate, and I sort of ended up here. And I was really lucky in that I wasn't required to have a financial background to get this position. So I'm in operations, but that means I just wear a lot of different hats. And I think that I was lucky that they, saw that I had potential to learn all of the financial background without having it already, and have the opportunity to make real change in this position without having that.
I'm glad they did that, because a lot of things can be learned on the job. pretty much anything. I mean, maybe for launching rockets, you want some other training.
Some school for that.
But I mean, if you have the passion, that's a lot harder to teach. I mean, I don't think you can take a class to get the type of passion you have. So kind of, I guess, going forward, Rochelle, what is Glasswall focusing on, and what excites you most about that?
Yeah, we have a lot of exciting things going on. I think one of the initiatives that we're launching, and I'm mostly focused on our early stage investment side, but we are launching what's called the Emerging Growth Consortium, which is going to be focused more on kind of growth stage investment. So what we really try to do at Glasswall is project what are the pain points in the industry going to be in 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, and how can we kind of get ahead of that curve and be there to support investors, be there to support founders ahead of time. And so that's kind of what we've been doing with the EGC, and our executive director, Macy Marriott, has been working really diligently on kind of getting that to launch. We're doing it in partnership with the Good Food Institute as a knowledge partner. And that is really going to be designed to support those institutional investors that want to get into the space and into Series B and beyond companies. So that's an exciting thing that we're launching this year, and we'll continue to kind of look forward and see where in the industry we can fit and how we can support founders and investors.
You're growing with it. I mean, that makes sense. You start with like the smaller investors, and then they're going to hopefully grow up because things are in then and then they'll become, well, as new technology is adopted, there's going to be greater demand, and entrepreneurs are going to want to benefit from that demand, and you're there to guide them the whole way. I think that's pretty cool. I'm curious, what are you most proud of that you've done professionally?
That's a very good question. I think being willing to take risk and change paths. So I don't think there's one specific project or something that I can highlight for this. I think it's really just saying, I want to be doing something different. That's scary. It's okay. I'm going to let go and pivot. And I'm fairly early on in my career. So maybe my answer would change in 5-10 years, but I think just that willingness to kind of take risks and change paths has served me well.
Taking risks has served you well. I think that serves lots of us well. And Rochelle, what are you most optimistic about?
I think I'm most optimistic in probably the advancement of food technology and where that's going with, fermentation, which is a technology that's been around for a long, long time, of course, but like precision fermentation, also been around for a while, but the applications that it has to make a real change for animals and for our food system. So seeing how that grows, I mean, there's already so many exciting things that we've seen with partnerships with Perfect Day, and more partnerships like that coming forward, and seeing how that will make real change.
Well, it's been so much fun talking to you. We'd love to have you back sometime, but in the meantime, where can people learn more about you, what you're up to, or where should we send them if
absolutely. Please send them our way. Our LinkedIn, we post a lot of updates on LinkedIn, so follow Glasswall Syndicate on LinkedIn. Also, we have our website, and then folks, if there are entrepreneurs out there listening to this, can apply for our pitch events and to be on our deal flow board to get visibility with our investors on our website, on our pitch application, and open round forms. So I would highlight those things. Please check us out.
Check them out. And Rochelle Jordan, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.